What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and they carry inside, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. Young people speaking their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop children, what's that sound? Everybody looks going down.
This is Lauren Steiner with the Robust Opposition. We have a really good show for you tonight, and I'm going to dispense with my new segment, which is the news segment, because this is a very complicated subject, and I want to devote the whole show to it. There is a coup d'etat sponsored by the United States going on right here in front of our eyes. U.S. officials and their stenographers in the corporate media are basically saying that the Maduro government is corrupt, it's illegitimate, it caused the economic hardship faced by the Venezuelan people, and that they, the U.S. officials, support the new self-declared President Guaido. The U.S. has seized the money from Citgo, which is the U.S. oil subsidiary, and is not letting it send it back to Venezuela. London has seized the Venezuelan gold. The U.S. leaders have recognized him, and we are paying the army to desert, and troops are amassed in Colombia for a possible invasion. All the worst neocons are advising Trump, and as far as I can tell, only 4 U.S. lawmakers, some journalists, and a handful of activists are protesting this. Tonight, we will talk to one of those activists who also wrote an excellent comprehensive article on his website, popularresistance.org, Kevin Zeese. I have known Kevin since Occupy, and I've fought side by side with him to stop the TPP and enact net neutrality. He was on my show 2 years ago when I first started doing the show in a segment I called Activist Profile. Welcome back to my show, Kevin.
Thanks a lot. Good to talk to you again.
You have explained why all the facts I mentioned in the intro are wrong about Venezuela and the narrative that we're being fed. So we're going to go over them over the course of the show.
Great.
But let's start with what you think is the real reason for the coup. This is a geopolitical conflict, as Venezuela is allied with Russia and China, and we are making both those countries boogeymen because we worry about losing our hegemony. In fact, my last show on Sunday, coincidentally enough, was called Is China the New Boogeyman? So can you describe what's really going on here?
There's a lot going on here, and there are several reasons for it. First off, Venezuela is moving towards socialism, and that's a bad example for Latin America and for the world. They've separated themselves from U.S. empire. They thumbed their nose at U.S. domination, and that's something the United States can't stand, especially in this time when U.S. empire is beginning to fail. Now, earlier this year, the Trump administration redefined national security as no longer a war on terror, but a great power conflict with Russia and China. As the economic sanctions in Venezuela began to hit, Venezuela has gone to Russia and China for loans, and Russia and China had become partners with Venezuela in their oil industry, which is the largest oil reserves in the world, their gold industry, which is the second largest gold reserves in the world, and their vast minerals that are critical for electronics in the 21st century. And so an attack on Venezuelan oil is an attack on Russia and China. That's a scary thought. And what's going on with Venezuela is this is actually a pretty hyper democracy. I know we get told it's a dictatorship, but in fact, that's not the real reason for this attack. This is geopolitical positioning. This is the U.S. dominating their backyard, putting in place the Monroe Doctrine, which keeps all other countries out of Latin America, and giving U.S. control of the region. You've seen Brazil, you've seen Colombia, other countries fall to the right. You make Venezuela fall, and that completes the task, almost. It's the biggest next country. If Venezuela survives, and I think it will, then U.S. continues to lack the ability to dominate. Just one example. During this crisis, the OAS, which is dominated by the United States, the Organization of American States, tried to pass a resolution to support this fake coup president. They couldn't get majority votes.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And
18 countries said no.
Yeah, and Medea Benjamin protested that. She is incredible. One day,
right during Pompeo's speech.
And then she protested another thing just the day before, or the day after. I mean, 2 in a row, and they're dragging her out. She's just, indefatigable.
She does great work.
Let's talk about, before we get into some more of these myths that we need to dispel. You write in your article that Venezuela is taking over as the head of OPEC, and that's the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. And you think that this is a threat to the US dollar. I want to talk a little bit more about the currency, because this came up in my show about China with the BRICS and how they have to beat down any country that is challenging the US dollar. But tell us why Venezuela taking over as the head of OPEC is a threat to the US dollar.
Well, already you have Iran as another threat. So you have these big oil countries, and Venezuela is the largest oil reserves in the world. And they're starting to trade in non-dollar trades with other countries like Russia and China. Iran's doing the same thing. If the U.S. loses domination of the U.S. dollar, that will be a catastrophe for the United States. You remember Libya, when Libya was destroyed during the Obama administration, and Clinton gaggled about the killing of their president Gaddafi. They were trying to form an African currency, again, to break away from U.S. domination. And that's when the United States went after Libya. Yes. And so this whole threat of OPEC, President, Venezuela, and all this problem with oil countries at this time, already Venezuela's creating an oil currency. And so breaking from that dollar is another threat of U.S. empire failing.
Okay, so now I want to talk about the economy, because I must admit that when the price of oil dropped, even I criticized Chavez, saying, why was he so dependent on oil? Why didn't he use that oil money to diversify the economy so that they would have agriculture, they would have industry, they wouldn't be so dependent on exports?
Yeah, and that's a big problem.
You answer that. You answer the reason for that, though.
Yeah, it's a big problem. It's a long-term problem. Venezuela discovered oil in the 1920s. It became a dominant part of their economy. Since then, during that time, domestic agriculture, domestic industry has become a smaller and smaller percentage of the economy. And this is due to what's called the Dutch disease, which affects any country that has a very powerful resource that brings a lot of foreign currency into that country. Makes it very hard for other parts of the economy to develop. Now, Chavez tried to do that. He tried to diversify the economy, increase agriculture. He did land grants to peasants so they could own their land. He tried to create cooperatives. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans became part of cooperatives and worker-owned industries. But then when the oil price got cut in half, it became hard to continue to do that. They tried to overcome the economics of the Dutch disease, but failed to do it. And so oil continues to be a major part of the economy. And as the oil dollar shrinks and as this oil embargo now takes hold, it's going to have a tremendous effect on the economy of Venezuela. But even during this crisis, and Venezuela's lost 25% of its GDP during this crisis. So that's a depression. Even during this crisis, Venezuela has still taken care of its poorest citizens. It's providing more health care, more education, more housing. Just last month, they surpassed 3.5 million houses built for poor people. That provides housing to 8 to 10 million people out of a population of 30 million. So even in the depression, they're providing housing for up to almost 1/3 their population. They're doing a better job than we're doing in Puerto Rico.
He expanded free health care to 60% of Venezuelans, and specifically in impoverished areas. He also increased doctors' salary by 50%. Maduro alone provided 1.6 million homes of the total number that you mentioned. It has the second lowest rate of homelessness in Latin America, expanded computers and technology textbooks. They have the highest literacy rate in South America. And another major accomplishment is he's put in a lot of Afro-Indigenous people, women, and LGBTQ people into his government. So even with this assault, as you said, he's made a lot of progress.
And this assault, by the way, this assault is an economic attack by the United States, but it's also the oligarchs in Venezuela seeking to undermine the economy.
Right.
So it's both an internal and an external attack.
Right.
The internal attack, these oligarchs will take food that's destined for Venezuela and sell it in Colombia. They'll put essentials like toilet paper in warehouses so people can't buy toilet paper and other essentials. And they've been caught doing this. The reason this is known is because this has been uncovered and oligarchs have been prosecuted. They've also played games with the currency to cause this horrible inflation. Maduro's made some mistakes there too. He's not been perfect, but it's a very hard job. Imagine what it must be like to have the wealthiest people in your economy and the wealthiest government in the world at war with you while your oil economy, the price is dropping by more than half. That's a very, very hard circumstance.
So we need to talk about the reason that we have the economic problems over there. And it's not just the hyperinflation, which he did also cause, but it also has to do with the sanctions that the U.S.
The economic war. Right. Yes, we have to have in addition to trying to stop an actual military intervention, which is another issue, we need to work to end these sanctions. These sanctions have cost Venezuela, estimates say, up to $8 billion. Just a few days ago, after this fake president declared that he was president, this new coup, the United States had put new economic sanctions on its oil industry, seizing $7 billion worth. They put pressure on London banks to hold over $1 billion in Venezuela's gold. And so there's a multi-level attack, and they've also made it very hard for Venezuela to get financial assistance from other countries, which is why Venezuela has developed a closer and closer relationship with China and Russia. So these economic sanctions are actually having the counterproductive effect from U.S. perspective of bringing China and Russia further into Latin America.
Right. Well, they keep using that failed policy of sanctions to try to get the people to overthrow their governments. And the only thing it does is it harms children. I mean, the Iranian sanctions, or was it Iraq?
No, Iraq.
500,000. The Lancet said 500,000 children were killed because of those sanctions.
And these economic wars and the other efforts at regime change actually end up unifying the people around Maduro.
Right.
Maduro's an imperfect leader. He's done a lot of good things that you already talked about: housing, education, healthcare. He's done a lot of good things for the poor, but he's made some mistakes as well. But when there's an attack like what we're seeing now, this U.S. coup attempt, it unites everybody around Maduro. Yeah. And he becomes actually stronger in Venezuela, not weaker.
I was watching an excellent program, Democracy Now! Today, with journalist Alan Nairn, and he did a whole show on this, a wonderful segment on Elliot Abrams, which I'm going to post that in the comments. So, because we don't have to get into all the horrible things that Elliot Abrams did during the Reagan administration. But he also said that Bolton was on Fox talking about the oil and how
that's right.
The oil company, because it'll make things cheaper for the American consumers, when in fact that's not even accurate. The fact of the matter is the oil company was nationalized before even Chavez took over. And their U.S. subsidiary, Citgo, which you talked about a minute ago, has been selling in the United States for decades. And the price of oil is set by the international market. So it doesn't really matter whether we take it over or not. The reason we want to take it over is how we use those revenues. And Chavez was using the revenues to, as you say, buy land for the poor. And the rich
and poverty, provide education, provide healthcare, all of the basic social services that people need.
And what was really interesting, he talked about, and I remember this at the time, and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that. Remember Joseph Kennedy, the representative, Robert F. Kennedy's older son? He was in Congress, and he did a deal with Venezuela to get heating oil, free heating oil.
That's right.
People in Boston.
Let me just say something about Elliot Abrams that's relevant to this.
Okay.
Now, his real crimes are Guatemala, Iran-Contra. He was convicted of Iran-Contra crimes and then pardoned by George Bush I. But on this issue, he was in the Reagan administration and was the person who gave the green light to the coup in 2002 against Hugo Chavez. So now we come full circle. He has brought back this war criminal, State Department official is brought back at a time when a coup is occurring in Venezuela again. But he was behind the 2002 coup.
Well, there's an excellent program on that now you can finally watch on YouTube. It's called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised."
That's right. That's right.
And I think it was maybe a Swedish film crew that was over there doing something else, and they happened upon this coup, and they documented it, and they found evidence that the U.S. was behind it.
Much about that coup is just another little piece of it. The coup president, the fake president at that time, who was the head of the Chamber of Commerce, after the coup was defeated by the people, and it was an amazing reversal in 48 hours. People's protests brought Chavez back to power. He fled to Colombia, neighboring Venezuela. Colombia is also where the people, you may have heard about the assassination attempt that recently occurred with drones against Maduro. They were trained in Colombia. Colombia is the Israel of Latin America for the United States.
Yes.
And it is a key player in this conflict. We have military bases in Colombia, and you saw that notepad the other day from that got a lot of attention from John Bolton, 5,000 troops to Colombia. Right. I don't know if that's real or that he's just trying to send a message through a fake notepad. I don't know what's going on yet. We'll have to wait and see. But that's because Colombia is a key player in this conflict.
Right. Now, I want to talk about Bolton and Elliot Abrams and Pompeo and all the neocons that are behind Trump's policy. But first, I want to just go back to dispelling some of the other myths.
Sure.
One of the myths being, and actually Ro Khanna, I was texting him tonight because I was so upset that nobody in the Democratic Party, except for Bernie, Ro, Tulsi, and Ilhan Omar, are speaking out about this. Even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez couldn't do anything more than just retweet Ilhan's, thing.
Let me just say a couple things on that. Progressive Caucus has come out against it, which is the largest caucus in Congress. That just came out yesterday. And Alexandria Cortez-Ortega is she's in the process of writing her statement. That's what her staff has said. So she'll be coming out with something too. So, but I agree, there has not been enough response. And even Bernie Sanders' response. Bernie Sanders' response, by the way, was the outline for our article.
Yes, so we're going to. He did a 3-part tweet, and it's really funny because I was tweeting Bernie, basically saying, "Oh, please don't agree with the regular." I was just like, "Please don't do this. Please don't do this," because then I'm going to have to make another video like I did with Sanders STFU when he started tweeting about Russia, and I was like, I don't want to have to make another video about Bernie. So it's like he had this really convoluted thing where he had 2 myths, and let's talk about.
Well, it was a 2-paragraph thing. Right, but the last sentence right, the 3 sentences before that were all wrong.
Right. Part of the tweet was right. He said we shouldn't be doing regime change.
That's right. The
first part he was saying fraudulent elections, and in Ro Khanna, in my text exchange with him tonight, he said, but the opposition boycotted it, and I'm like, but the Carter Center said this is like the gold standard of all elections. And he writes me back, did the Carter Center monitor this one? And of course, I didn't have time to research that. But
I was down there for that election. I was in Venezuela for the presidential election.
Okay.
And I saw the election operation. Jimmy Carter said it was the best election system in the world. Not the Carter Center saying that. That's Jimmy Carter saying that. And it is a very impressive election system. And there were about more than 150 election observers. And the unanimous opinion was this was a legitimate election, transparent and democratic. And the reality is the way that Venezuelans actually vote is there's no way for there to be fraud. To start the voting process, the voter has to come in and give a fingerprint. Then at the end, they have to give another fingerprint when they're done. So you see it's the same person. When they vote on an electronic machine, but they also get a paper ballot that they look at and verify and put into a ballot box. At the end of the day, this was the most amazing thing, and no country in the world does this. This is what sets Venezuela apart. They do a people's audit where it's done in public. All the opposition parties are watching. The Electoral Commission videotapes it and shows it on TV. They go through 52% of the machines at each precinct, randomly chosen, 52%. And they dump the ballots out on a table, and they pick up a ballot. They say Chavez, they say Macron, and they list and they show it to all the people in the room. Here's the ballot. Everyone can see it. And they count each of those ballots by hand and compare that count to the machine count. This is on election day, the night of the election. Before the election result is given, they do that audit, which is incredible. And so it is the best election system in the world. Now, what happened was, it was obvious to the United States and the oligarchs that they could not win the election. And they can't win the election because they represent a very small minority of the population. And because of the way they've acted, their protests have been violent, attacking civilians, attacking hospitals and schools. Just a terrible record of violence by the opposition.
Yeah.
They lost political power. So they realized they could not win the election. So they decided, under U.S. pressure, to try to boycott the election. Maduro got 67% of the vote. 46% of the people voted. Henry Macron, the opposition candidate, got 20% of the vote, and there were four other candidates. So out of 6 candidates, Maduro got 67%, 9 million votes out of a total population of 30 million people. That 30 million people includes people who can't vote, like children.
Right.
So that was a very successful and legitimate election. Calling him a dictator is an absolute fraud. He's more legitimate than Trump.
Right. And so
Trump didn't get a majority of the votes in the United States.
You talked about opposition violence. See, this was in the second part of Bernie's tweet, which is that the government is being violent against protesters.
Against nonviolent protesters, they say, which is a total falsehood.
So I had Abby Martin and Mike Preisner on my show last year, and they saw it in person. Tell us what they witnessed and what you know about this situation.
Well, there have been 2 series of insurrections by the opposition. Again, when they can't win elections, they try these tactics. 2014, 2017, and their tactics are very interesting, and you've seen them in Syria and Nicaragua as well, other U.S. coup attempts. What you see is violent protests, and what they do is they try to film the government's reaction to the violence, and then they just take that piece of the film of the government's reaction to violence and say, look, the government's being violent against nonviolent protesters. They don't show you what the protesters are doing. And in fact, Abby Martin says that when she was down there, and I quote this in the article and give you a link to it, she was told by the protesters, only film what the government does, not what we do. Because they don't want people to see the full story. They don't want to see the violence of the opposition and the government responding. The government tried to respond with nonviolence. They made arrests, they tried, but if the opposition wants violence, they keep coming at you and try to force the government into violence. Yeah. So no, the Venezuela government was not violent against non-violent protesters. Okay. They had to deal with an insurrection of violent protests. And what's really interesting about this, just to give a little one amazing story about the opposition. They won an election for the National Assembly. They got a majority. One of the first laws they passed, this is just a few years ago, was a law that was an amnesty law for 17 years of coup attempts, of felonies, of terrorism, of economic, trying to undermine the economy, of hiding food, of they passed an amnesty law that listed all their crimes for 17 years. Is that amazing? The Supreme Court of Venezuela ruled it was unconstitutional. In fact, they ruled that the National Assembly was in contempt of court because there were 4 members who were illegally elected, and they refused to remove them. And that was the difference between a supermajority and a majority. They needed that supermajority because they wanted to remove Maduro with legislative action, but they refused to remove the 4. Two of these legislators were from the opposition parties, and they refused to remove them from office. So they're in contempt of court, and they're the source of this fake president.
Well, can you address, because when people talk about what the National Assembly did, they said it's perfectly legal, and they cite Articles 233 and Article 233, It says this is exactly the procedure that the assembly knew when the election was not honest, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, the U.S. media and the bipartisans in Washington who support this coup don't read that 233 of the Constitution, which is very clear. If you do read it, it's if the president is unable to serve as president, then the National Assembly president is the next in line to be president. But Maduro is not unable to serve. He is serving as president. So that section 233 is totally irrelevant. And so when this Guaido was appointed, and Guaido was an unknown politician, he came from a low population state, the second lowest in the country. He only got 20%. He came in second, enough to win a legislative seat but only with 20% of the vote. So he's a nothing politician. And Gray Zone has a fantastic article about his history, which shows that for the last more than 10 years, he has been groomed by U.S. regime changers at the National Endowment for Democracy and at George Washington University to take this kind of role. So this is a regime change president put in place by the U.S. government. This is a U.S. coup. The day before the coup, Mike Pence put out a video saying to the people of Venezuela, rise up, saying to the majority, do a coup. The night before the regime, the fake president announced, self-appointed him as president, Pence called him and said, we'll support you. The day of the coup, minutes after he self-appoints himself, Trump recognizes him. Then all the conservative right-wing governments that are allied to the United States immediately recognize him. Then the Europeans allow the United States recognize him. They have all the social media going. The Western media is doing their lies. So this is a very organized coup. And they had a mass protest plan for that day because it was anniversary of the end of a dictatorship. And they had a protest plan that day for this coup. So they spent a month planning this protest. But even on that day, in response to the coup, the Maduro protests on that day, organized that day, not a month, that day, were bigger than the protests in favor of the coup. Right. So even then, the Maduro government showed it had the support of the people, and the military has said, we're supporting Maduro, not this fake president.
Well, I want to talk about that in a little bit, but first I want to mention that Ro Khanna on Democracy Now! Said it's absolutely ridiculous that we're complaining about Russia interfering with our election, and yet nobody says anything when our vice president calls that guy the day before to cheer him on, you know? I mean, this is ridiculous. So let's talk about these neocons in there. You've got Pence, Pompeo, Bolton, and now Elliott Abrams. Why do you think Trump is targeting Venezuela when he's on the same time he's saying we need to get out of Syria, we shouldn't be in these regime change wars? I mean, that was one thing I liked about Bannon. Certainly not his white but I liked that he wanted to get us out of the TPP. I liked that he wanted to get us out of regime change wars. Well, I mean, that's one thing I agreed with Alex Jones about. And now here, Trump is doing the very thing that he decries in Venezuela. I mean, why did he put Bolton in? Do you have any? Well,
yeah, I'll tell you. First off, in mid-2017, it came out in public that Trump had been calling for a war in Venezuela, mentioning that the oil was there. And the generals around him at the time, remember Trump had appointed a bunch of generals to various positions in his cabinet, told him he was crazy. Now all those generals are gone. Now he's surrounded by neocons, and they are aggressive. Now, why are they picking on Venezuela? Multiple reasons. First off, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. Second, has the second largest gold reserves in the world. It has many minerals that are essential to the electronics for the 21st century. It is an example of a country that has said no to U.S. empire and was doing well until the drop in oil prices, was doing well. And so it's a bad example for the rest of the world to see a country break from U.S. imperialism. In addition, it's a country moving toward socialism, the Bolivarian process. It's still a capitalist economy, but moving towards socialism. That's their goal. And that is another bad example. The U.S. has traditionally had the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America, which means that no European country could colonize any country in Latin America. Well, now you have Venezuela making alliances with Russia, China, Turkey, and other countries that are not in that hemisphere. And so the Monroe Doctrine is having its nose thumbed at. And so for all these reasons combined, Venezuela is a target. If Venezuela is forced to go to a neoliberal, capitalist, U.S. allied government, that would be the kind of final domino to fall after they've taken over Brazil with that incredible coup there, after the right wing has taken over Colombia, or kept control of Colombia, even though the left wing made a very strong challenge in the Colombian presidential race. We are seeing Venezuela as a key to kind of completing the end of the left tide that had been building in the early part of this century.
Now, do you think that American politicians really understand this? I mean, this morning, Ro Khanna had an op-ed in the Washington Post, which started out like this. The Trump administration's embrace of the self-proclaimed new leader of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, reeks of the highly ambitious social engineering that has been at the cornerstone of neoconservative thinking for a century. The old gang is back at it. And then later in the article, he writes, for decades, I have watched neoconservatives paint those who oppose their interventionism as appeasers of dictators, standing in solidarity with socialists, soft on Russia, naive about terrorism, lacking moral clarity, and unappreciative of America's unique role in the world. The truth is, such jingoism scares off dissent at a time when it is most needed. Progressives, unfortunately, seem to win the argument after the fact, decrying interventions years after the human suffering and financial costs are all too obvious. Should we not ask the difficult questions before we get ourselves into another mess? So I'm asking the difficult. I think that is really apt. It's really apt. And we know that we tried this movie, but we've seen this movie before. It doesn't work out. So what are people supposed to do? What are leaders supposed to do?
First,
let me just say one thing that he said he's going to do in this article. He said that if they try an intervention, he's going to invoke the War Powers Act, which he and Bernie Sanders and Mike Lee stood up today, and they talked about Saudi Arabia and they talked about Yemen, but not a word about Venezuela came out of their mouths.
Yeah, well, that's a key point, that last point. And it's not just the War Powers Act, but the Constitution makes the Congress the superior branch of the government, not the president. The Constitution makes the Congress superior. Congress is the only part of the government that can declare war. So Congress should insist that before any military move against Venezuela, that this get brought to Congress for debate and consideration. If we have that debate, it will be an opportunity for the movement for peace and justice and stability in the world to speak up and tell the truth about what's going on. The issues we put under a microscope. And because we have the social media, shows like yours, and Facebook and Twitter and so many email and networks, and we have lots of ways to get our message out now. If there is a debate, people will learn the truth. The narrative will come out that in fact Venezuela is a democracy, Maduro is not a dictator, that U.S. has been working to undermine the economy, that oligarchs have been violently trying to undermine the country and the economy, and that the best thing for the U.S. to do is not to invade militarily, but to end the sanctions.
Yeah.
Then Maduro will not have the unifying force of U.S. imperialism. Then he can run the government. If he does a good job, he'll get reelected. If he doesn't, he won't. But right now, what you have is the threat of U.S. imperialism, allied with Colombia and Brazil. The threat of imperialism and military action from those countries is going to unify everyone around Maduro. And I can tell you, this is a war the U.S. will lose. Russia already has a battalion in Venezuela. Russia has military bombers in Venezuela. Russia has warned the United States to stay out of Venezuela militarily. Venezuela has an army of 20,000 troops. It has a militia, a civilian militia that Maduro created when the U.S. was threatening war before the election. He created a civilian militia of 1.5 million people, armed and trained. and you have a country unified against imperialism. If the U.S. and Colombia go into go into Venezuela, they will be fought back hard by a population of millions of people saying no to their imperialism. This will undermine the president of Colombia, who didn't do as well as expected. The left wing did much better than expected in the last presidential race. A war in Venezuela will hurt him. And in Brazil, the right wing president's not on very firm ground. They had to put Lula in prison in order for him to win. And so they're not on very firm ground. If there's a war in Venezuela, those two governments will be weaker, and Trump will look like a loser because Russia will defeat the United States again, just like Russia did in Syria. So it'll be a terrible mess for the U.S. to go into Venezuela militarily, and it's our job as people in the United States to stand up with the people of Venezuela who do not want a military intervention, who want those economic sanctions to end by more than 85%. A poll just came out. You can see it on Popular Resistance. Poll just came out that says the people don't want that. We need to stand with the people of Venezuela and stand against U.S. imperialism, U.S. regime change efforts against a democratically elected government.
So I want to talk about the military, because Alan Nairn was saying that, you know, the military is being paid to defect. We know that the U.S. is talking to them about putting them, like in this new government, putting key military leaders into top positions. All these conversations are being had. What he was saying was that in the first coup in 2002, they had no chance because the people and the military were clearly behind Chavez. Now, you were just creating a very optimistic situation about, you know, the military being behind. You think that the military will stay strong behind Maduro, but he was saying that the people, not so much because of the economic.
I disagree. I heard that interview, and that's the one part I disagree with him on. Yes, there's a big economic catastrophe. When I was in Venezuela for the election, in addition to seeing the elections, we were there for a few days. We got to see Venezuela itself and toured some areas. We were looking at their rail that goes up and brings the workers from Caracas up into their homes in the mountains. And we were waiting for a train. A woman came up to us, an older woman, and she started to criticize, say, "Why is your country attacking us? Why are they? Well, we know you want our oil, but why are you undermining our economy?" The people in Venezuela are very well aware what's going on. They know they're under attack by the United States. They know the oligarch opposition is allied with the United States. They know that the oligarch opposition has used violence, hidden essentials in warehouses, sold food in Colombia, attacked a maternal hospital was attacked by these opposition. It's crazy. Putting babies at risk. It's insane. Attacking schools. What's that about? I mean, and so people are not supportive of the opposition. So I think Alan is wrong about that. My sense, and Maduro won by 67% of the vote. And I can tell you, even though there was a boycott, not everyone who didn't vote was opposed to Maduro. I was talking to a taxi cab driver in Caracas. "Are you voting?" "No." "Why not?" "I know it's going to turn out." "How come?" "Maduro is going to win because the opposition is not participating." "I would vote for Maduro, but I'm not going to bother." And we saw reports of in some parts of the city where the opposition was using protests to prevent people from voting. They didn't want Maduro voters to go to the polls either. And so even though he won by 67% in a boycott election, not everybody who didn't vote was anti-Maduro. There were pro-Maduro voters who didn't vote as well. So I think he has the support of the population. Not much has changed since that vote, which is just less than a year ago. In fact, since that vote, we've seen an assassination attempt against Maduro. We've seen reports come out about how the Trump administration was meeting with people in Venezuela to try to do an overthrow of the government. That came out and was made public. So more and more information's come out that U.S. and the oligarchs are trying to topple the government. The people do not want. People may have criticism of Maduro. They don't like where the economy is right now. They know it's not all his fault, but he's made some mistakes. But people do not want U.S. domination. They do not want a neoliberal oligarch government.
Right.
So they want that less than Maduro. So people are uniting behind Maduro. I think Alan's wrong. If they were to try a real coup in Venezuela, it would be a bloodbath. It would be obscene.
There was a really interesting article in Counterpunch about that, in which they said Guaido has already discussed plans to ramp up the privatization of Venezuelan oil.
That's right.
As well as going to the austerity-hungry IMF, who will demand nothing less than their typical restructuring economic packages that target the social programs created by Chavez and Maduro. Ironically, it was the IMF austerity that sparked the Venezuelan revolution nearly 30 years ago with the Caracazo uprising.
It's amazing that the first two actions of this fake president are privatize oil, so the money can't go to the Venezuelan government, but goes to the oligarchs and denies the people of their necessities. And the second thing, an IMF loan to put Venezuela in the debt of Western bankers and under their control. So again, just like that stupid amnesty law they passed when they got control of the legislature, these first actions show the people of Venezuela why this fake president is not someone they want.
Okay, so now let's talk about what the politicians should do and what the people need to do. Now, Ro Khanna is coming on my show again, and I got his direct ear on this. And he basically said, when I said, Ro, I put this frantic voicemail, and I said, I'm sorry I'm so impassioned about this, but it's making me crazy to watch this go on and to see the politicians, except for you and a couple of other people, make statements and go on, you know, our friendly media. I really wish AOC would take this up, because the mainstream media tends to focus on what she says. And she's got a huge, you know, fan base out there in the progressive community. I'm not to say that Bernie Sanders doesn't, but he made his sort of obligatory one tweet, and now he's back on to, you know, the other issues that he feels much more comfortable talking about. So,
and his one tweet was very confused.
It was confused, yes.
Yeah.
And so now Ro is on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think Ilhan Omar might have also gotten onto that, and she's on our side. Do you think that he could press to maybe hold hearings on this and bring in people that understand the truth? Because somebody like you comes in, somebody like Abby Martin comes in, some other people from from Venezuela come in and talk about really what's going on over there, and we shed light, and these are, you know, C-SPAN airs them. I mean, do you think this is something that he should ask for, is some hearings, aside from just, you know, going on Democracy Now! and writing op-eds? Yeah. Of
course. There's a lot that any member of Congress can do. And I do think AOC will come out in the next day or two with her statement. As I said, the Progressive Caucus, which is the largest caucus in the House of Representatives, came out against it. That required the whole Progressive Caucus to agree to that statement. So that was a very positive step. So I expect you'll see that. And I think the demand has to be two things. One, before any military action, Congress must decide. Trump cannot unilaterally go into Venezuela militarily without congressional authorization. Doing so would be against U.S. law and against international law. And so I think Ro Khanna needs to be very clear about that. Second, we've got to face up to these sanctions. These unilateral sanctions that the United States is putting in place are acts of war. These are, I believe, illegal under international law. Other countries are saying this, by the way. Multiple countries are saying that these unilateral actions by the United States are illegal under international law. I think Ro Khanna and other members of Congress need to start to question this routine of sanctions that results in the deaths of people, thousands and thousands of people, and is counterproductive as far as trying to change the government. It unifies the government against the United States. Yeah. And so I think Ro Khanna needs to focus, and activists, we all need to focus on those two issues. End the sanctions, no military intervention. Yeah. I think those are the two areas where we need to work. And I think our job as activists is to take news. There's a lot of positive reporting on this. There's a lot of excellent analysis that rapidly happened on independent news sites. Ours was just one of many. And we have a lot of weapons, a lot of tools that we can be using in social media to get the message out. We should use Twitter to use those reports to send them to key people in the Congress, as well as key people in the media, to let them know that the people know the truth and that they can't get away with lying to us.
Well, let me ask you why I don't feel there's a very strong anti-war movement in this country anymore. And I think the reason they had one back in the Vietnam days was because of the draft. And I have always agreed with Charlie Rangel that we need to reinstate the draft, because when wealthy people's kids have to go fight, you're not going to see so many wars. I mean, right now it's where poor people go because they can't, there's no more manufacturing jobs. They can't afford to pay for college. They don't want to be in debt for the rest of their life to pay for college, and they go there to get free college, and it's really horrible. And so obviously the veterans and the people whose families of veterans care about war, but the vast majority of activists I know, I don't see this on my social media feed.
I agree with everything you said so far. Let me try to put a little more context, though. President Obama defeated Hillary Clinton because he was against the Iraq War, or said he was, and she voted for the Iraq War. So that destroyed Hillary Clinton. President Trump defeated Hillary Clinton because he said he was against these foreign interventions and Hillary Clinton was for them. And she had a record of supporting every war throughout her 30-plus year career in government. So she had a war supporting record, a pro-military record, and Trump said no, in his campaign at least. He said no, he opposed that. So he defeated her because the people of the United States are tired of these never-ending wars. Whether they are activists on it is a separate question.
Yeah.
But there is an organized anti-war movement, and it's small, but they are organized and they respond. We've had protests against the Syrian war. We've had protests against war in Iran. We've had protests on Korea, and we are moving the needle. Even though we're small, the anti-war movement is able to move the needle because we know the population supports our view. They don't want another war. Right. They don't like the fact that 60+%, up to 67%, some studies say, of the domestic discretionary spending, of federal discretionary spending, is on the military. Right. At a time when there's poverty and homelessness and inequality and low wages and lack of health care. We're funding 60% of our discretionary spending on the military. It's absurd and obscene. So yes, there's a small anti-war movement, but we have the majority on our side. And when a small movement has the majority, they can move issues. So if this issue comes before Congress, we will stop it in Congress.
Okay. What one action, before I let you go, what one action do you want people watching this show to do tomorrow?
I want people to go to popularresistance.org, look at our most recent newsletter. Our job is to educate the public on the truth, because the opposition is trying to put out a false narrative.
Right.
It's our job to correct that narrative, and we have the tools to do it. We cover Venezuela on Popular Resistance. Like we have.
Well, what about having them call their representatives and say,
sure.
We do not support recognizing this new government of Venezuela.
Do that. That's a good thing.
Not support invading Venezuela.
Yeah, and arm yourself with the facts. The facts are out there. We have the information, and then we know who the people are we have to influence.
Right.
535 members of Congress. We are millions of people. We can influence them to do the right thing.
Okay.
So it's our job to get the information and influence the people who make the decision.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm sure I'm going to have you back on the show at some future time. I just want to let you know that my upcoming show is on Sunday. I'm going to be having Jackie Goldberg on for the first 45 minutes. She is running for school board here in Los Angeles. She is a former teacher, former school board member, and former Speaker of the Assembly. She's very experienced, and she's running for Ref. Rodriguez's seat. He is the former disgraced LAUSD board chair, charter school shill, who was indicted for ethics violations and was forced to resign, but he held on to his seat just long enough to approve Austin Butner, investment banker with no educational background, to be our superintendent of schools. The teachers struck for 6 days. They got some good victories, and I think the biggest victory they got was getting the general public in Los Angeles to understand the danger of charter schools, that they're not this innocuous thing that most people think they are, that they're actually contributing to the privatization of public education. And we really need to get our school board back, because currently we have a charter school majority. Nick Melvoin was elected last year in the most expensive school board race in the country. $17 million was spent on this race to put him in. and he did his bidding. He did the bidding of the Charter School Association yesterday when he was the only one. Even school board president, charter school shill Monica Garcia voted for this resolution, and it was part of what they had agreed to settle the teachers' strike, which was that LAUSD would resolve to tell Sacramento that they need to put a moratorium on further charter schools because they're destroying public education. There's going to probably be a teachers' strike in Oakland, which percentage-wise has even more charters than Los Angeles. Los Angeles has the highest number of charters, about 277, but Oakland is just inundated percentage-wise. I don't know the number off the top of my head. I'm going to have Mike Hutchison on my show to talk about this. And then after Jackie Goldberg, I'm going to be interviewing Jenna Siegel-Schwartz and Nicole Pfeffernan, who founded a group called Parents Supporting Teachers. This was a Facebook group that did not exist a month ago, and within a couple of weeks, they had 25,000 members. So I'm very anxious to talk to them to find out how they plan to use that Facebook group to further organize for future fights. And then on Wednesday, I'm going to be interviewing Libby Halevi, who wrote a book on the 40th anniversary of 3 Mile Island, which was a near nuclear meltdown in the United States back in 1979. And also someone who is fighting to stop them from burying radioactive waste underneath the beach, 100 feet away from the ocean in San Onofre, the nuclear plant that's being decommissioned. What could possibly go wrong? Can anyone say tsunami? Anyway, so that show is going to be next Wednesday night, and I'm working on some great shows for the future. So if you're just joining me for the first time, please follow me on Facebook. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, Lauren from LA, or follow me on Twitter at Lauren_Steiner. So until we see each other again, keep fighting.